It has never been more clear that humans are causing climate change. We have got tens of thousands of weather stations and a wide-spanning literature on tree rings, glacier ice core samples, lake and ocean sediments, and cave deposits, all of which indicate that global temperatures have risen at an unprecedented pace. By burning fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, and oil, we are emitting levels of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane that we haven't seen in 800,000 years, a period where humans nearly went extinct due to changes in climate. What makes this worrying is the potential consequences, which range from but aren't limited to an increase in heat-related human mortality and morbidity, foodborne, waterborne, and vector-borne diseases, mental health challenges, flooding in coastal and other low-lying cities and regions, biodiversity loss in land, freshwater, and ocean ecosystems, a decrease in food production, cryosphere-related changes in floods, landslides, and water availability, and the projected increase in frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation, leading to a growth in rain-generated local flooding. The cost of climate inaction, or a 3-degree increase in global temperature since the Industrial Revolution, what we're on track to reach by 2100, is about 1.2 quadrillion US dollars. The main way we emit greenhouse gases is through using energy, whether that be electricity powered by coal-fired plants or driving diesel cars. That amounts for about 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So to really get at the root of climate change, we either need to reduce energy consumption or change where we get our energy from.
Nuclear energy, unlike fossil fuels, is clean. It's the cleanest, it has the lowest greenhouse gas emissions of any energy source, and it's safe. It's the second safest form of power generation. And compared to renewables, not only is it incredibly reliable, but it's also, and I think the most important thing is, it's a proven technology.
If you're going to tackle global warming, nuclear is the only way you can create massive amounts of power. Thank you very much.
And if you look, wind and concentrated solar have the lowest CO2 emissions. If you look at the graph, nuclear, there are two bars here. One is a low estimate and one is a high estimate. The low estimate is the nuclear energy industry estimate of nuclear. The high is the average of 103 scientific peer-reviewed studies. And this is just the CO2 from the life cycle.
In a topic as important as energy, it's pertinent to note where the talking points are coming from, who's driving the discussions, and the money behind it all. Nuclear power tends to be, though isn't necessarily, supported by the conservative side of politics. For example, 67% of Republicans support nuclear energy compared to 49% of Democrats.
Baseload nuclear is absolutely critical to the reliability of the grid and all those other things. And it's non-carbon emitting.
This guy called climate change folklore, by the way.
Where I'm from in Australia, the Conservative Party here has recently taken up nuclear power. At a conference for the Coalition for Conservation, a donor of which is coal businessman Trevor Baker, numerous Conservative ministers spoke at length about renewable zealotry and the need to transition from coal to nuclear. Speakers included current leader of the party, Peter Dutton, and the party's climate change spokesman, Ted O'Brien.
With nuclear, there's no need to carpet our landscape and coastline with industrial scale solar and wind farms, or indeed the 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines needed to make them work and distribute that energy.
The Conservatives in Australia have also been at the forefront of prolonging the much-needed energy transition. Their near-decade tenure in government was mired by the expansion of fossil fuels, including coal and natural gas infrastructure. This government also had numerous ties to the fossil fuel industry. In 2013, they won office from the Labour Party in part off the back of a campaign against a tax on carbon dioxide emissions, and within a few months axed numerous climate change-related initiatives and institutions. The Minerals Council, a similarly anti-renewable pro-fossil fuel lobby group, one which helped the Conservatives get into power, has astroturfed anti-renewable and pro-nuclear campaigns such as Get Clear on Nuclear. Conservative media overwhelmingly publishes pro-nuclear energy pieces with the intention of shifting climate change and the need to use alternative energy sources from an environmental problem to a purely technical problem. Just as carbon capture lobbyists play to continue the expansion of fossil fuels under the false guise that it can all be retained, the anti-renewable nuclear lobby, one evidently tied to the fossil fuel industry, sees nuclear as an effective wedge against renewable energy, which can be and has been used to prolong the use of coal and gas. By creating an air of contention, controversy, and uncertainty, necessary action can be delayed as people are divided and unsure about what the truth is. inaction necessarily has led to the expansion of fossil fuels and the further degradation of our climate. Of course, this isn't to say that the renewable sector is purely grassroots and independent from industry. From a nuclear perspective, all these oil companies like Origin and BP tepidly spruiking their renewable energy investments could be seen as a wedge against nuclear.
And I do know the economics. This misinformed, unscientific, uneconomic, plucked out of the air, thin air, bulldust of nuclear policies of politicians masquerading as leaders helps no one.
And this is a problem with the current ways we're trying to put more renewables on the grid, but I think the key difference here is that this is done much less. Much of the nuclear lobby seems to be overtly interested in maintaining fossil fuel production, at least in the medium term. Some of the biggest advocates of nuclear, seemingly from an environmental perspective, for example Michael Schellenberger, didn't take too long to collaborate with climate denialist media and spread climate disinformation. Companies like Origin and BP conversely make up a minor portion of renewable investment and aren't interested at all in lobbying for renewables. Regardless, it's always important to keep in mind who's saying what in discourse, particularly with an issue with so many vested interests involved and propagandizing. Just because it may be in the interest of fossil fuel companies to prolong a renewable energy transition by feigning support for nuclear doesn't mean that nuclear is an inherently bad way to deal with climate change. There are many people who earnestly see nuclear as the best and most effective way to help mitigate global warming. The most optimistic in the available literature do suggest that nuclear energy can be effective in decarbonizing. Unfortunately, however, even these projections are insufficient. Berger 2017 suggests that the world can meet 60% of its energy needs from nuclear power by 2100 if it multiplies by 50 current nuclear energy production. This is based on an extrapolation of nuclear infrastructure construction in 1970s France.
If one reactor per week were added, the share could be quadrupled to around 10% if energy demand stagnated at the level of 2015. Reaching 70% would require a new reactor every day. How likely is any of that?
Now, even if possible, it would be completely insufficient in making sure that we don't reach those climate tipping points. We need to be carbon neutral or net zero by 2050 for context. The IPCC has even noted in its most recent academic reports that nuclear power is likely not to be a major player in reducing emissions by 2030. Nuclear on such a scale in such a short time, unfortunately, is infeasible.
That's what the opposition leader Peter Dutton's been talking about. An optimistic timetable could see one of them potentially up and running in the mid-2040s. So is it your policy to keep coal-fired generators running longer?
The IEA, a historically pro-nuclear institution, has even come out in recent analysis suggesting that net zero by 2050 can only be achieved in scenarios where nuclear energy comprises around 10% of total energy production. Conversely, the literature modeling a 100% renewable system is abundant and clear. It is possible and necessary by 2050. The median amount of time it takes for a nuclear plant to start producing power in 2023 was just over 10 years, and this hasn't really come down. Conversely, the time it took for wind and solar respectively was around 4 years, and these times have been coming down drastically over the decades. If we were to purely pursue nuclear and minimally or not at all invest in renewables, fossil fuel usage would expand and we wouldn't even meet our climate targets. So timeline-wise, it isn't the most effective way to deal with climate change. At most, existing and planned nuclear infrastructure should supplement growing renewable energy supply.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal.
Countries like France and China are often pointed to as the epitome of nuclear power by its advocates, the former for having relatively low emissions, and the latter for completing nuclear projects much faster than the global median. The most common comparison made to France is, of course, Germany, as the latter chose to shut down its nuclear facilities only to burn more coal and gas. The former has kept their nuclear facilities and has kept their emissions low.
Que c'est le bon moment. Parce que c'est ce qu'il faut pour notre nation et parce que les conditions sont maintenant réunies, c'est la renaissance du nucléaire français.
For starters, I do think the choice to close nuclear power plants without the adequate renewable infrastructure was a bad move from Germany. But these two examples aren't as comparable as is often portrayed. Before France had most of its energy needs come from nuclear, Germany was already emitting double the amount of greenhouse gases compared to France. This means the French were already at an advantage. In fact, since Germany began phasing out its nuclear power, its emissions have fallen by 18%, whereas France's emissions have fallen by 16% in the same time frame. And it's not as if France has been immune to prolonging or extending the lifetime of its fossil fuel facilities either. Now, China has also been at the forefront of nuclear energy expansion, and it's been championed by its advocates for its relatively short construction times.
China is outpacing the United States by at least a decade in developing nuclear power.
In 2011, the government aimed to have 5% of total electricity generation come from nuclear by 2035, 20 to 25% by 2050, and 45% in the second half of the century. But even these relatively short construction times couldn't match the government's goals. They missed their 2020 targets and thereafter revised their 2035 target to 10% and their 2060 target to 18%. Because nuclear uptake was slower than anticipated, China resorted to continuing to expand its fossil fuel infrastructure. Though it has been contested in the literature before, the most recent studies encompassing over 100 countries suggest something similar, that renewables are effective at mitigating carbon emissions, yet the same can't necessarily be said about nuclear. Another example that isn't talked about as much is South Korea.
South Korea has become the 6th largest nuclear power producing country in the world. Korea, which currently has 25 operational reactors, has plans for another 8.
South Korea's government has opted to expand its nuclear capacity, shut down its coal plants and abandon renewables. Based on peer-reviewed modelling, if the world were to adopt South Korea's nuclear program, we would see 4 degrees Celsius of warming, a scenario that would at the very least force literally billions of people to migrate from the equator. This is because, again, the infrastructure for nuclear power would take so long to complete that the country would need to keep open and inevitably expand its coal and gas facilities.
Gigawatts would be left to an independent body to work out how many gigawatts. The independent bodies would look at each plant and come up with a recommendation as to what sort of technology should be used, and from there it would be exactly what capacity based on that technology. So you won't know before the election how much nuclear energy we're going to get. We'll be crystal clear on what we're planned for 2050. That's what you just said. The independent body will work out how many gigawatts. Well, there's 2 things happening here, Dave. 2 things happening right now.
Specifically in countries like Australia, nuclear power is probably out of the question. While the cost of instituting nuclear would likely be less than the cost of doing nothing about climate change, Australia is uniquely poised to build renewable infrastructure.
Is that we've got the world's best combination of solar and wind resources. We've got the world's best biomass resources as well. We are extremely well placed. So as the world moves to green products, as the world moves to net zero emissions, we are the ones who can supply the world with the cheapest products using the world's cheapest renewable energy.
Now, when the CSIRO's Gen Cost report came out and basically affirmed the fact that nuclear energy would be a vastly more expensive venture than renewable investment, a bunch of lobby groups that have historically been very cozy with the fossil fuel industry came out and dismissed the report for a few reasons. The Institute for Public Affairs, or the IPA, said that the metrics used by the CSIRO, the levelized cost of electricity methodology, was inaccurate to the point of being completely useless. Only, the IPA was more than happy to use the LCOE when attacking renewables only 2 years ago. But okay, what the IPA says about the LCOE is basically that it doesn't account for all of the costs of energy production. So for example, it doesn't properly account for capacity costs. Here, the IPA states that, oh look, if you account for all these things, fossil fuels are actually cheaper than, well, they're only cheaper than wind. Solar is still cheaper even after you add all their variables. But okay, even if you use the IPA's flawed methodology, which magically detracts 5 years of asset life from renewables based on one Daily Mail article and then increases 10 years to coal-fired plants because one plant had its lifetime extended,
and then take away the risk premium on interest for financing coal plants because it's unfair for fossil fuel companies that the government recognizes climate change, which makes them less competitive than renewables because some people aren't keen on investing in killing the planet. But also, what they don't mention is that coal plants differ in cost of debt, equity, size, and complexity, and short-term refurbishments are harder, which all makes it less attractive for investors. So taking away that risk premium completely is unfounded and just so happens to be the largest factor in driving down the cost of coal. And then they use loads of average capacity factors for wind and solar, but the highest recorded capacity factors for coal compared to an average of 59%.
This paper fucking sucks, but even at renewables most expensive, even if you add up all those caveats that the LCOE doesn't supposedly properly account for, renewables in Australia are still cheaper than small modular nuclear reactors. This then leads to the second complaint made by people at the Centre for Independent BHP Studies, who said that the Gen Cost report only talks about small modular nuclear reactors and excludes large-scale reactors, which, yeah, it's true.
Just not large-scale nuclear. The CSIRO decided to exclude large-scale nuclear from their analysis and only include small modular reactors, or SMRs.
GenCost only talks about SMRs. If you take away the 58 times the paper mentions large-scale nuclear plants, you guys should get Shell to fund a webinar on how to control F on a document. Plus, there's plenty of research out there like the analysis done by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, which, yeah, puts large-scale nuclear at a higher LCOE than that unnecessarily high IPA estimate for renewables. We can also see how cheap renewables are in real time. While prices in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria rose dramatically in 2022 due to the prices of fossil fuels spiking internationally, the ACT, which is 100% renewable, bucked the trend and saw prices fall. Now, renewables everywhere are cheaper than fossil fuels and nuclear, but in Australia particularly, we have an abundance of pretty much every renewable, whether that be solar, wind or hydropower. And that means we have a massive opportunity to export renewable energy, whether that be through underwater cables or even in green hydrogen to other countries. Australia also has a significant amount of uranium, and while it makes a lot of sense to pursue renewables here, we can export our uranium for countries that might not be in such an advantageous position. Countries shouldn't decommission their nuclear power if there's not adequate long-term renewable infrastructure ready to replace it. Likewise, countries with high thorium deposits like India should and are using that to supplement decarbonization. By 2050, India plans to source 30% of its energy from thorium nuclear reactors. There is a lot of misinformation and unfortunate assumptions about nuclear energy. Despite the disasters associated with it, nuclear power is relatively safe compared to fossil fuels and even renewables like hydropower. Waste storage is relatively fine, although we would need to expand it massively if nuclear were to become a major energy player, which comes with its own complications, though this can be mitigated by pursuing purely thorium nuclear as it doesn't produce as much waste, but then you're kicking the can down even further as thorium reactors are not nearly as commercially viable as the already unviable uranium reactors. The point is that nuclear is not holistically inherently bad. We shouldn't completely shun nuclear energy investment or capacity, but we should recognize where strategically it fits and where the propagandists try to force it into the discussion. A common retort or counter-argument to 100% renewable scenarios, and implicitly an argument for nuclear, is that of baseload.
Baseload power. I keep hearing the term baseload power.
Baseload generation.
Reliable baseload power.
Imagine you've got the electricity grid right in front of you. You've got baseload, you've got intermediate load, and peak load. Baseload is the energy you're constantly producing at all times. Intermediate and peak seek to match the trends and needs by consumers. So obviously during the day, people need more electricity than they do at night. The argument then goes that because renewables are intermittent, or they only produce electricity when the wind blows or the sun shines, they can't provide that constant baseload. Nuclear, on the other hand, can do that very well. In this old video where I sounded awful, big shout out to you if you're around at this time, I talk about baseload and renewables at length.
But what if I told you that we don't even need baseload power? That it's an outdated and inefficient way of meeting minimum demand, that it's ultimately a red herring? An increasing body of literature cited by Ben Sovacool finds that interconnected, geographically dispersed renewable energy systems are just as efficient at meeting energy demand, and that any variability renewables incur becomes easier to manage the more they are deployed. Once again, Sovacool states that the barriers to large-scale renewable energy production are not technical, but social and political.
Baseload is a mental shortcut for engineers that can't think dynamically.
Not only would a 100% renewable grid not need baseload, but it would actually be more efficient and flexible and cheaper to have what are called smart grids. As opposed to having one central place where all the energy is belted out, energy production can be regionalised. If it's not sunny in Adelaide but it is in Perth, Perth can then supplement South Australia's energy needs. This is already being done, by the way, only it's renewables supplementing states where their coal-fired power plants fail. South Australia, for example, is a net energy interstate exporter 3 times over. Another example is Uruguay, where they've basically reached 100% renewable at this point via a mix of hydro, wind and solar, and research into its grid suggests that if the country were to be smarter or more regionalised as opposed to primarily relying on centralised hydropower for baseload, it could lower both operational and wholesale costs, soften stress, and importantly, mitigate the impacts of droughts, which will be a growing problem given current climate projections. So while obviously one wind farm in and of itself is intermittent and probably unreliable, regionalized networks of these renewables can create a dynamic and carbon-neutral electricity grid. Nuclear is bad, kind of, in certain situations. Nuclear alone or primarily would be an ineffective way at doing what this whole conversation is about, transitioning the way we consume energy in order to minimize greenhouse gas emissions to hopefully mitigate catastrophic climate change. Renewables supplemented by existing and yes, some new nuclear infrastructure is the way to go. In countries like Australia, nuclear makes zero sense, but in countries like India or France, investing in and maintaining nuclear infrastructure might make some more sense. Unfortunately, such a message will likely be drowned out by the endless and worthless debates that will come along with mass media, which will serve as a distraction that ultimately benefits those interested in keeping the current polluting system.